Hello, I'm Yang Rui with the Dialogue. Today we shall talk about the far-reaching impact of the new media throughout the world. When traditional media's advertising revenue is declining sharply and that of the new media rising quickly, when Western politicians are turning to the new media such as YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter for their campaign fundraising and campaign success, and when digital technologies turn every internet user into a content provider and a broadcaster, can traditional media survive the tough competitions? Today we are joined here by Professor Ernest James Wilson, Dean to the Annenberg School of Communication with the University of Southern California. But first, let's look at this report.
For real-time information on what's happening around you and the world, CNN and other TV networks may no longer be your first choice. During Iran's election last week, many people in the US turned to microblogging site Twitter because of the absence of instantaneous coverage of the event in the traditional media networks. Many believe this example of internet-powered news consumption and distribution is affecting how traditional news organizations gather and report on news. Hit by both the financial crisis and the booming new media, print press and TV networks have struggled with heavy debt, a downturn in advertising, and a loss of readers and viewers to the internet. Social media sites such as Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter are challenging the position of traditional media as the agenda setter and opinion leader. The myth that the internet elected Barack Obama as the US president makes some sense in this new media world.
Welcome to Dialogue, sir.
Thank you.
Do you think the new media is likely to replace the old media completely?
That's a great question, Mr. Yang, and I think the answer to that is no. There is always a fear that the new incoming media will replace the old. So when television was invented, there was a great fear that television would replace the radio. And in fact, all of them learned to live together. So I think with the legacy media, like broadcasting on television or radio, or blogs or other kinds of new media, that in fact it will be a richer universe containing all of those.
But the matter of fact, I'm afraid, Mr. Wilson, is that owners of the traditional newspapers, for example, are fighting a losing battle if you look at their faltering business model.
Yes, that's exactly right. There is the great irony that the business model is not working for these newspapers at precisely the time when many of them are going online and they're doubling or tripling their numbers of viewers at the New York Times or the Washington Post, but they can't figure out how to pay for this transition.
Whether new media owners are forging what we call the cross-media ownership. They own the old media and they own the new media. Let's look at Rupert Murdoch, who took over Dow Jones and the Wall Street Journal, yes. And he is, of course, the owner of other traditional print media.
Yes, exactly.
He's the richest media tycoon
exactly
in the world.
Yes.
And look at the latest rise of the sales of Wall Street Journal amidst the current freezing winter for the traditional media. What do you think of this exception?
Well, I think it is an exception, and this is very worrisome for those of us who teach journalism in the United States. And I think it's a worry about democracy in general, because in the absence of a vibrant, independent press, it's very difficult to sustain the kind of information in the public interest that we need to sustain. So while the Wall Street Journal is doing reasonably well, newspapers, great American newspapers like the newspaper in Boston, the New York Times, the Seattle Post-Intelligence, are really suffering. So I think there is an effort on the part of the legacy media to learn something from the new media in the same way that the new media can learn something from the legacy media.
What do you mean by something here?
Well, I think there are two things. One is that the newspapers in the United States tended to be monopolies or duopolies. In other words, for New York or Washington or other great cities in the United States, there was only one newspaper, or maybe two. As a consequence, they tended to be very conservative in their thinking about the adaptation of new technology. So it took them a long time to do that. Now they have realized that that's important, so they're going online. So it's important for the legacy media, the old media, to learn from the new. But I would also suggest, Mr. Yang, that it's also important for the new media to incorporate the values, the traditions of impartiality, of balance.
Earlier, you asked the question about whether America will remain a democracy with a declining traditional media.
Right.
What do you think of the prospects for having America as the flagship democracy?
Well, I think it's a very, very serious issue, and I'm delighted to say that those of us who try to educate the next generation of Americans are deeply concerned about this. There's the business model issue, but no independent information in the public interest, no democracy. And so we're seeing public intellectuals and the American private foundations trying different experiments. For example, there's one experiment where a private foundation has given $20 million to a new entity just to do investigative reporting. And then they take those reports and make them available free to publication. So we're in a moment of, I think in Chinese it's wei ji, of
Crisis and
opportunity. And we confront both of those. And we're now in a period of great experimentation all around the world to see what is going to work to provide both entertainment and transparency to sustain the kind of democracy that at least we would like to see.
One of the virtues the new media enjoy compared with the declining influence of the traditional media is that editors and reporters could interact with their recipients, right?
Yes.
Receivers of the content.
That's right.
In a very dynamic way,
Yes.
because instead of the point to a group, traditional relationship, here is the relationship between a group and yet another group, right?
Yes.
When you examine the impact of the new media. So my next question is really very much about say the influence of blogs. I mean, blogging might be likely to replace investigative reports as the kind of in-depth reporting. What do you
Yes.
think of the possibility?
I think that's exactly right, and you point to a very important point, which is that there are blogs that are about all sorts of issues. Some blogs or things like YouTube have pictures of people's cats playing games. Others engage in very serious investigative reporting, both about very local events where people can take pictures with their cell phones and report on local events. So I think that the blogs, in fact, will open up the possibilities for dialogue and better information in the future. The challenge is to educate the citizens so they can recognize the bad blogs and bad information or wrong information from good information and correct information.
But we have the demand side and the supply side. For the supply side, I think they run the risk of liability if their behavior gets rampant. They would allow to capture whatever moments of seriousness, for example, scandals, or just a small mistake could be amplified endlessly, ruthlessly, right?
Exactly.
So that has a lot to do with the liability. Does that worry?
Yes, it worries me somewhat, but not as much as it used to, because I've been looking at some research, including research that we do at the Annenberg School for Communication on the use of the internet and blogs, especially by young people. And what we're discovering in China, in Brazil, in Nigeria, in the United States, is that young people look at the media in a different way. Number one, they want interactivity. They don't want to just get information in one direction. They want to talk back. They want to engage into a conversation.
It's what we call the popular networking.
Yes, and we see that all over the world. Secondly, they want to create their own content. In the old days, the only way we could get news was to turn on the television or buy a newspaper. Now, young people want to create their own stories and share those stories around the world. The BBC, I visited their headquarters recently, and the BBC has created a whole new unit just for online user-generated content, hiring 17 people to verify that what is submitted by their listeners and viewers is in fact accurate.
You talked about education for the next generation of journalists.
Yes.
Is your school doing that job?
We believe that we are, and there is no magic way to do it. We've been going through trial and error. So when we first started educating our young people about the new media, we taught them equally audio, visual, online, print, and it proved to be too much for the students. So we've now had to go through some some reform, as it were, to come up with a curriculum that will allow the students to learn traditional ethics, to learn how to write and think well, but also how to understand the new platforms from the cell phone all the way up to television screens. And I've been struck in this visit to China how much my other dean colleagues at leading journalism schools in China are wrestling with the same issue of how do we educate the next generation.
I believe you have visited Fudan University, the China University of Communications in Beijing.
Yes. Tsinghua as
Tsinghua
well.
University. You must have talked to Professor Li Xiguang.
Yes,
What's your impression about the reform or Gaige in China to reinvigorate our traditional media, and at the same time they would not lose, the old media would not lose its edge?
Yes. Well, I think that there are some common themes that have emerged in the conversations. Number one is that all of my colleagues here in China are trying to readjust their teaching to meet the new demands of globalization, the new opportunities for demographic change as more people become middle class and more educated. Their tastes will change. They're trying to bring in traditional media as well as the new media. I have learned some things from my Chinese colleagues that I can take back to Los Angeles to use as we reform our own curriculum.
What are the particular points that you think you can take home?
Right. One, I think, is the importance of blending practice with theory, in the sense that journalism schools can no longer be a pure entity on a hill. We have got to talk to the media producers. We've got to talk to the companies. We have to talk to government. We have to talk to nonprofit organizations. And that's something that I will take back with me. We were speaking today with some of my colleagues about doing a joint meeting of American and Chinese journalism schools so that we could have a meeting later on this year to share best practices. And I think that's a very exciting possibility, that we can learn from one another globally.
All right, thank you very much. You are watching Dialogue with Professor Ernest James Wilson, Dean to the Annenberg School of Communication of University of Southern California. We are talking about the revolutionary implications of the rising new media in the age of globalization. Stay with us, we'll be right back. Dialogue is a big part of my life. Many people tell me that they like our program because we always respond very quickly to breaking news events, and we talk to eyewitnesses, experts, authorities, and above all, insiders. And we'll never stop asking why, so long as you, our viewers, want to know more.
Au cours de ma carrière, j'ai visité des centaines de châteaux dans le monde entier, mais le château Shangyu AFIB Global est le château de classe mondiale qui me tient le plus à cœur. Ces vins sont mes vins préférés.
Professional recommendation by World Master of Wine, Chateau Changyu AFIB, Global Beijing.
Qingdao Draft Beer. Refresh your life. CCTV Sports and Entertainment, the exclusive advertising agency of CCTV 9.
Welcome back, sir.
Thank you.
Nancy Pelosi, the spokesperson of the American Congress, raised the issue of antitrust when it comes to the possible coalition of the traditional media about how to turn it into a commercial player.
Yes.
I wonder whether you can brief us on the progress and the challenges that the lawmakers are facing in this particular regard.
Yes, that's a very good question, and it's an area where there is no right answer yet, and we're all doing experiments to see what works. One difficult obstacle is financial, which is that up until very recently, when Americans wanted to sell a house or sell a car or buy a car, they would look in the newspapers, and they would send money to the newspapers to print their advertisement. With the rise of the internet, they don't do that anymore because they can place their advertisements online for free. And so what this has meant is that newspapers have lost 30, 40, 50% of their revenue that was allowed them to pay their reporters. So in response to that, they said, we'll give away our content for free. Come online to WashingtonPost.com and you can look at our content for free. They're now discovering that for every dollar they lose on the traditional payment, they only get a dime, 10 cents, for the new media payments. So they want to get together to change that. But the American law says that if any 2 or 3 or 4 companies get together to talk about fixing the price, then it's illegal. And so they're going to have to get Nancy Pelosi or other people in Congress to modify the law or to interpret the law differently to allow the newspapers to get together to set a new pricing scheme so they can survive.
Perhaps the lawmakers should have introduced their second amendment other than the first one, which
Yes.
guarantees the freedom of the press.
Yes.
Well, let's take a deeper look at the ambition of Mr. Rupert Murdoch and his way of forging the cross-media ownership.
Yes.
He bought MySpace and he bought Dow Jones and Wall Street Journal, which is promoting its sales unusually. How do you look at his success? And do you think that has set up a very good example for others?
Well, I think his desire was both to diversify his risks and to diversify his opportunities. In other words, when he bought the online space, he said, well, it looks like it's going to rise, and if it continues to rise while traditional media declines, then he will have diversified his assets so he can gain. But buying the Wall Street Journal, he was also buying a special property, a blue ribbon property, which will allow him to diversify his risks in case the new media doesn't take on and doesn't pay. But Mr. Murdoch has very deep pockets. And the big risk, I think, is not so much with the very large corporations, the News Corp or Fox, although they are having difficulties. I think that the real challenge, Mr. Yang, is at the local level. Then my greatest worry is that the local news that we rely on for our daily life is going to be lost. So I think the Rupert Murdochs will be able to do well. The question is, in the villages of China or the villages of the United States or Europe, will there be enough support for them to continue to do their important work?
What's your prescription?
I wish I had an easy prescription. What we've discovered
Certainly not a shock therapy.
Certainly not shock therapy. But I do think the government has a role to play here. I think all of the partners, first of all, have to realize that this is a matter of huge national interest. It's not just commercial interest, it's national interest. Number one, I think that a new business model will have to be found for these papers, which may mean modifying the law, as I talked about it earlier. Secondly, we have a tradition in the United States of what we call private foundations, to give money. People get rich, they set up a foundation to give money to others. So I think that's a second opportunity. Thirdly, it may be that local community groups will pool together to provide content at very low cost that will cover local education issues or local health issues.
I'm afraid observers of media development may point out that Bill Gates and his team may show more serious interest in having a competition with, for example, Google
Yes.
News instead of traditional newspapers.
Yes.
Well, that's what you call the role of the philanthropy society. But let's look at the role of the government, which is more controversial, I'm afraid, in
Yes, it is.
comparison with the private parties. Is it correct or politically correct for the government to step in at this critical moment?
That's a hot, as we say in English, that's a hot button issue in the United States for historical reasons, for ideological reasons. And there are some people who believe that the government simply should not get engaged in these kinds of issues, whether it's health care or newspapers. So some opposition will say the government should just keep its hands off, shouldn't play any role, and then let the market decide. Others will say, by contrary, and I put myself in this position, that in the United States the government has always played a role in the media. The government had special tax rates for newspapers. The government allowed newspapers to be sent through the mail at a much cheaper rate than other kinds of communications. The government owns the air channels in the United States of America and then leases them to private or other groups. So the government has an important role to play. I do think that because we are in an economic crisis in the United States, President Obama is finding it easier to say that we have to do these things not for ideology.
Professor
but to
Wilson,
save-
you were a key member on the transitional team of President Obama
Yes.
after he won the campaign.
Yes.
Was it one of the ideas for you and your team to address the issue of the declining traditional media? Do you think President Obama has shown any signs of any serious interest in saving the traditional media the way he tried to save the banking system as well as a part of, for example, General Motors?
Good question. I think that what's interesting about President Obama, especially from I'm a baby boomer, and so what we're seeing
Like
is
Bill Clinton.
that, like Bill Clinton, for whom I worked at an earlier point in time, and we see a new generation coming to power now. It's a very different generation, and they have different views about the market. They have different views about globalization. They have different views about race. They have different views about media.
Is that because they are, first of all, the biggest beneficiary of the new media? Because without the internet, he would not have raised so much campaign funds.
Absolutely.
Right?
In fact, I visited the White House about a month and a half ago, and I met with a young man who has a very interesting title. His title is Special Assistant to the President for New Media. And so he has three.
How old is this
I
assistant?
don't even want to say. I don't even want to say. Maybe he's in his late 30s or something like that. But the team that's now in the White House honestly believes that they would not have won if it were not for the new media.
Before I forget it, do you think President Obama is computer savvy?
Oh, I know he's computer savvy. You know that he.
That's very different. Very different from for example, from Tony Blair, who knew little about
Yes.
the internet.
Yes, and that's why I think it's a real generational change. And they have different views. I mean, one of the biggest negotiations at the White House was not just between North Korea and the United States, it was between the newly elected President of the United States and the Secret Service, because the Secret Service said, we don't want you to keep using your BlackBerry
Understandable.
because of all sorts of security reasons. And because President Obama is of that new generation, he says, you can't take my BlackBerry. How will I communicate? So I am convinced, and I've seen evidence, that President Obama is very, very sensitive to these media issues, both on the commercial side, the use of new media, and also something that we in the United States call public broadcasting. There's a very small segment in the United States where the government pays for TV, the government pays for radio. And he has demonstrated, and his people at the Federal Communications Commission have demonstrated some support, some sympathy, let's say, to make sure that these continuing public media are able to survive.
Fareed Zakaria, a famous
Yes.
editor
Right.
of New York Times
Yes.
said, America has been able to globalize the rest of the world, but failed to globalize
Itself,
itself.
yes.
That partly explains, perhaps, why some of the Western media journalists refuse to recognize the results of the campaign in Iran, the Islamic Republic of Iran, from the perspective of the Arabs or from the Persian state itself. This could be a campaign of demonizing Iran. At least technically speaking, people in Iran are able to use their cellular phones, the mobile phones, the computers to generate votes, right, to advance the campaign slogans of
Yes.
different candidates. Although Western countries are very skeptical about the seriousness of the candidacy
Yes.
and about the way the campaign is undertaken, I'd like to have your perspective about the technical means which has been employed widely in the Persian state in advancing what they call the presidential campaign.
Well, I think, Mr. Yang, it really is, in principle, it's the same thing that we see in the United States with young people using their cell phones as not just a device to talk to people, but by voice, but to send text messages, to send political messages, to organize politically, to raise money. So I think we see this in the Arab world, we see it in Iran, we see it in the United States. So the technical means are there, and it's relatively easy.
And do you think the technical means is likely to change the political roadmap?
I think that that these new media, these new social media that allow interactivity, they allow greater transparency, are affecting the United States, they're affecting China, they're affecting Iran. But they're not doing it in a one-to-one change. In other words, you don't get a new cell phone and suddenly everything becomes more transparent. There's more of a back and forth between social values and social views on the one hand.
But social
and the use of
mobilization
the
certainly
technology.
assumes a different look, right?
It does, and I think, going back to where the United States is right now, without being partisan about this, I think the United States has gone through 7 or 8 years of looking inward, of 8 years of minimizing democracy, diplomacy, both traditional diplomacy as well as what we call public diplomacy. And what we're going to see in the United States is the rebuilding, if you will, of a conversation between the United States and the rest of the world. And in that conversation, new media will play an important role, but new media by itself cannot transform a society. It can help to transform it, but it needs also progressive political leadership to make those changes possible.
How do you foresee the future of the old media?
I think, again, as we started this conversation, Mr. Yang, I think one of the questions you asked was, do we have a zero-sum game where the old media does this and the new media does that? And we don't see that in the history of communications technology. This television show, we still have television, and it's vibrant, and that's where most people get their news from. But we also still have radio, we still have shortwave radio, commercial radio, and newspapers. So I think, to go back to the word weiji, this is a time of opportunity and danger, and I want to close on the note of opportunity. For those of us who are interested in transparency and democracy and information in the public interest, what a wonderful time to be alive. What a wonderful time to be working on these things, because we have an opportunity both within countries and, as importantly, between countries to communicate our values and our interests and our concerns in ways that we have never had before in the history of humankind.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.